My name's Deszca. I'm from Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Canada, and I'm here at USB to deliver a talk in the LeadersAngle series on organizational change, in particular organizational change leadership. We'll deal with three particular areas: the need for change, the vision for change, and frankly also the issue of implementation of change. And I hope you enjoy the treatment of the skill sets which are critical to making these processes occur in an effective fashion, and an edited version of the talk is available on the web. In terms of what we'll be up to today, there's really sort of three areas, and we're going to focus into the third. The first is taking a look at the reality that we're dealing with when we're trying to grapple with organizational change. And I should be really clear that the kind of change that I'm going to be talking about is organizational change that happens within organizations. This is the reality that we seem to have all over the globe, and it's messy and getting messier. Is that consistent with your realities here as well? Change goes through some fairly predictable cycles. You'll kind of hit major inflection points where you'll have fairly sort of radical transformations that tend to happen. Then you'll go through periods of incremental change, like as things kind of sort out, the organization tries to sort its way into new forms of alignment. You'll see lots of attention to continuous improvement, incremental change along those particular paths, until that particular approach or series of approaches seems to start to run out of energy, and you find yourself facing another period of more turbulent change. It seems that as you sort of deal with this sort of rapid growth of knowledge, rapid dissemination of technology and processes and procedures around the globe, that those periods of incremental change are getting shorter, more compressed, and they're bumping up against these periods of more disruptive change in a more regular pattern. And that seems to be the name of the game right now as we're trying to kind of sort out what's emerging next. That's kind of the reality that I see from Canada right now. There are some folks who manage change who tend to go at it more from an incrementalist perspective, and they tend to be much better at that than the more management of the more disruptive sorts of change initiatives. And there seems to be those individuals who are very, very good at the management of more disruptive sorts of change. And what's kind of interesting is that organizations obviously need both. But oftentimes those folks have real difficulty communicating with each other. So the question that I really want to grapple with and spend most of the time on is, how do we make this whole process more manageable? Do we get there by simply trying to run faster? Do we get there by closing our eyes and tossing the dice and hoping that things work out? Fight or flight? I mean, pick your metaphor. What is it that it's going to take in order to help this process become a more manageable one? And there's going to be sort of 6 areas that I'll talk about briefly that I think are all connected to this ability to facilitate alignment and realignment. I think that they really represent critical skill sets. When you're dealing with smaller incremental changes, you've got fewer variables at play. As you start to move from the incremental changes to more systemic changes, to changes of strategy, to changes of culture itself, because the strategy can't exist or can't get fulfilled unless the culture of the organization shifts and changes as well. Obviously, the number of variables at play are almost exponentially increasing that you're going to have to try to manage. Let's talk through those areas of competence that I think are really important to change leaders. The first one, not surprisingly, is you better understand yourself. Because these are the eyes and the ears that are going to try to make sense out of what's going on around me. And if that's not going to be working well for you, if there's biases and blind spots that you're not working hard to become aware of, if you're not working really hard to understand your own strengths and weaknesses, so that you've got your own sort of personal development agenda at work, or frankly an agenda that talks about who is it that I need to be deployed with? Who is it that I need to be having conversations with? Who do I need to be working with in order to make sure that we're able to do the kind of job that needs to be done? So the first piece about knowing yourself, I think, is really important. Obviously, egos, past practices, past successes get in the way. I mean, what's one of the most strong predictors of future failure in an organization? Past successes. Why? You get trapped in them, don't you? This one really sort of talks about a continuing capacity to understand what's going on in the external environment and in the internal environment. And this is really around organizational assessment. So it's one thing to have the self working well, but then you've got to deploy that self in terms of looking at the problems or the questions around organizational change. It's talking about sort of the importance to be flexible and adaptive in terms of how you attempt to go about learning. Trying to sort through who are the people in effect who you could have conversations with that in effect will cause you to potentially see the world differently than you do right now. How much time do you devote to this activity? I'm willing to bet that you probably spend a fair bit of time looking internally. That'd be fair to say? Here's a guess. That many of you may not be spending very much time looking externally. How many people would spend 5 hours a week looking externally? Show of hands? Okay, not very many hands going up there. The need to get out and spend time and spend energy looking, learning, getting yourself disrupted, getting out of your own comfort zone. Making that an important part of your activity as opposed to a nice-to-do activity. The other thing that I would say about this is that sometimes the local or the immediate environment can be the most dangerous because you'll sometimes assume you know things that you don't. That leads us to the next area of competence that I want to talk briefly about, and that's around taking that information that's floating around out there, because it's one thing to basically have it, but how do we make sense out of it? So this is that analytic piece that becomes so important, the ability to think through, see, interpret patterns, make sense out of what's going on, in order to then be able to articulate the need for change. But if you can't figure out how to articulate and have a meaningful conversation around why do we need to change and what do we need to change to, what does that look like, and how is that different from where we are now? How big's this gap and how are we going to close it? If you can't have those kinds of conversations, typically you'll have the knowledge that things need to change, but the ability to mobilize folks in a meaningful, constructive direction I think is problematic. So it's around those two sort of sets of activities, the need for piece, which comes out of that analysis, and the articulation of the vision for change, so that you have a clear sense of where this gap is that you're trying the chasm that you're trying to cross. Maybe there's only one skill: communication, communication, communication at the end of the day. But this really talks about the ability to kind of take those kinds of, well, not only take, but to develop those kinds of ideas and then be able to articulate them. And they basically emerge, I think, out of the conversations that happen over time. So that ability to communicate with, engage others, to actively to create an environment in which there's active engagement and participation, development of communities of shared interest, those sorts of things are really critical to the development of the process. And again, it's not a one-way conversation. It's a two-way conversation. It's a multi-way conversation. And that sort of level of understanding evolves over time, I believe. When we talk about communicating vision, you don't communicate vision by talking at people. I don't think. I mean, that's part of but you better be listening. And frankly, you better be open to learning things along the way. And it's that ability to build trust and work with others. Authenticity, a sense of presence, I think is really, of all the things I've learned over the last little while, a colleague, Linda Leitonen, basically, is the one I learned the obvious from, but I'd forgotten about it, is the importance of presence and engagement. If you take a look at the skills of really highly honed leaders, one of the things that's really true is they have this capacity to basically engage in a meaningful way. That interpersonal skills are helped when you're working hard to understand your own motivations and feelings and emotions and those of those around you. If you're working hard on those kinds of pieces, then you're likely to be able to advance the conversation. Energy and commitment and courage to follow through are obviously really, really critical. But balanced with that, flexibility, adaptiveness, resilience, and frankly, a sense of humor. I mean, if you're doing change, you know something, as soon as you start, you know it's not going to work out just the way you planned, right? Things will get derailed along the way. You're going to stub your toe. You'll make mistakes. That goes with the territory. One type of change is basically change which saps energy out. So in other words, if you sort of deal with the change, it depletes energy. By the time you're done, you feel spent. There's other sorts of change initiatives which seem to energize. Well, if the only changes will have both of those, because changes have got grunt work. Sometimes there's unpleasant things you have to do along the way. But if there's not some degree of balance, you're going to run out of energy. Then there's a whole sort of host of sort of skills that I would sort of categorize as sort of implementation skills. The two that I'll talk a little bit more about are the latter two. When you're dealing with complex changes, so we're moving away from the sort of the incremental changes to the ones which in effect are more broadly based. And we're talking about trying to implement the change, bring about change and implement it when you're dealing from the middle of the organization. Well, when you're dealing from the middle of the organization, the ability to build coalitions of people who would have a shared interest in helping to move this particular initiative forward, trying to figure out how do we move those particular conversations forward, how do we get permission to run a pilot project on this to see how it might work. I mean, all those kinds of incremental things are really assisted when you've got some of those coalition building skills in your hip pocket. That ability to build trust and work with others is a function of your reputation. That reputation develops over time. And you know something? It takes a long time to develop it, but boy, can you ever destroy it quickly. For me, the trust piece is the currency that change agents bring to the table, because you get things happening as a result of referent power and expert power. You don't get there particularly because of formal power. The measurement skills piece really talks to measurement and control processes. It's the steering controls. It's the awareness of where the boundary conditions are within the organization. What kinds of behaviors are on, what kinds of behaviors aren't on. Those sorts of things. By on, I mean, not tolerated. Or if you're having to do things that alter culture, alter boundary conditions, how do we basically do that in a systematic fashion that's not going to destroy trust along the way? The interesting thing about this is that the same skill sets that we're talking about here that you might think of in terms of times of growth and sort of positive kinds of change experiences, those same processes seem to also hold just as well when you're dealing with very, very difficult changes such as plant closures, shutdowns, layoffs, and those sorts of things. The measurement piece, I think, for people doing organizational change is sometimes the piece that's the least well done. And I can't quite figure out why that is. And I know that from my own behavior. I think it's sometimes because you think you know what it is you ought to be paying attention to, and you hope that you're going to be doing it. But frankly, do your best objectives don't necessarily produce much change, do they? You know what I mean by that? If I say, let's get together for lunch, and you say, yeah, great idea. If somebody doesn't say, how about next Thursday? 12 o'clock or something, it's not very, very likely to happen, is it? This really talks about the kind of environment as a change leader you try to create. Is it one that energizes? Is it one that basically nourishes the soul? Or is it one that basically saps energy from the soul? Your ability to basically make things happen in an organization is inversely related to how much concern you have over who gets the credit. The more concerned you are about that, the more it gets in the way. So, in conclusion, facilitating alignment and realignment represents a critical skill set in organizations. I think it's a critical set of expertise that needs to be developed. I hopefully have made the argument that I think that exists throughout organizations, not simply at the apex, and frankly, sometimes it's not at the apex. And that smart executives, in effect, know how to create conversations that basically mobilize these leaders within their context. Things don't stand still. These periods of evolutionary and revolutionary change, in effect, are realities. So change is the norm. It's not abnormal. It's normal. I think that it's absolutely critical that you don't look at this as something that you kind of get done with and then you get on with. This is a process of ongoing development. So that notion of honing your skills, being courageous, actively engaging others, hopefully in trying to create that sense of an empowered environment in which people can make things happen, I think is really, really critical. And I come back again to that last point on the other slide, which is that caution that your ability to accomplish things is inversely related to your concern about who gets the credit.